Hello and welcome to the Backfield, the running back analysis podcast. I'm Big Italy 42. He's Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. And coming off of a tumultuous week, I guess we could say. A lot of letdowns, including the first guy on the list here. But you got to have a short memory in DFS. Hindsight is 20/20, but the most important things with these things are to make sure you're not results oriented. You got to be process oriented, as we talked about on many podcasts this week. So a lot of people mad at themselves, mad at their process, things like that. Things like that happen. There's variance in every sport, of course, injuries, things like that happen. So it's kind of a perfect tie into our first player here. The article that you wrote up, Marshawn Lynch for the Seattle Seahawks, facing off against the Bears defense that, if you ask me, Bears are easily a top 5 or bottom 5 overall team. Their defense may be even worse than that. And Seahawks coming in at 0-2. They get Cam Chancellor back this week. Got to imagine that not only are they going to get off to a lead, but they're going to be able to score and move the ball at will against this defense. And Marshawn Lynch is obviously going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, and I usually just use Lynch when he's at home and the Seahawks are favored because that's, the safest time to deploy him. Kind of strayed away from that last week going into that game at Green Bay, just because Lynch had such a good track record against the Packers, and Matt Forte tore them up a week prior. But obviously that didn't work out. But Lynch is in for a huge bounce back outing this week. Like we said, playing the Bears at home. Seattle's favored by 14.5 points. So this just has the writing on the wall that it's going to be one of those feel-good wins for Seattle. They're going to get everyone involved, going to get everyone their numbers, including Lynch, and just really hammer Chicago and, make a statement that they're going to make a run this season again.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely a great spot for him once again, and not a bad price tag, especially on DraftKings, just $7,400 there, so good spot for him. Next up, a guy, and this is the reason why you have a short memory, Adrian Peterson, week 1, didn't get many opportunities, wasn't good with the opportunities that he did receive. And then week 2, went out and dominated the Lions. Didn't even score a touchdown, but ended up with almost 200 total yards. 8,900 on FanDuel, 75 on DraftKings. And he's facing off against San Diego, a team who was absolutely gashed on the ground by Giovanni Bernard last week, who, while he's a talented runner, nowhere near the caliber or strength or skill, any of those things of Adrian Peterson. So that's not to say that Adrian Peterson's going to necessarily have that type of production. But, if anyone can replicate that, it's Peterson, and obviously he's once again the focal point of this offense that overall is not a great offense, but, it's tough to stop a guy like Adrian Peterson.
Yeah, and before I get into Peterson, I just want to note that I had a really hard time deciding between Le'Veon Bell and Peterson in this elite play column, but ultimately I went with Peterson because he's at home. They're favored, and that San Diego defensive front is a little less intimidating than Bell's matchup with St. Louis in St. Louis. So ultimately, that's why I went with Peterson. The Vikings are 3-point favorites at home this week. And San Diego ranked 29th in yards per carry allowed last season. And so far this year, they've gotten gashed by the Lions and Amir Abdullah, and they got gashed last week by Gio Bernard in Cincinnati. So you like how this sets up for Peterson. Teddy Bridgewater looked a lot more comfortable last week at home. I'm expecting some of that to carry over this week. I think ultimately that helps Peterson give a little more balance into the offense, take some of the pressure off of him, and then he's able to, run through bigger holes. And, I think 100-plus yards is a very realistic stat once again here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he even had a couple passes last week that he caught in the backfield, but not a huge part of his game. But he was productive with those at over 50 yards.
And he fumbled going into the end zone. Otherwise, he would have had one more touchdown. But you figure they won't really hold that against him going in. He should still get those goal line carries.
Yeah, and I think he had a touchdown that he scored also. They got called back on holding or some sort of penalty in the offense. So, that could have been a huge performance for him. Could have definitely changed some of big-time landscape. And a guy who was on one of the winning rosters, won $1 million last week, Dion Lewis for the Patriots. Obviously, the Patriots running back situation, kind of a fickle situation, and we've seen LeGarrette Blount now is back in some regard. He's physically there. He didn't have much of a factor last week, but New England a big-time favorite in this one, and we've seen Dion Lewis look good running the ball. He's looked great out of the backfield, and certainly not a guy that you're going to build your team around, but as far as a cash game play at his price, especially on a full PPR site like DraftKings at his price. Makes a lot of sense as a guy that's been really heavily involved because, I mean, this offense so far, there's really been three guys. It's Edelman, Gronk, and Dion Lewis.
Yeah, and I mean, it was really surprising last week seeing him. He fumbled the ball twice, I believe, and was still in there, still getting bulk of the carries, still getting red zone carries too. So, I mean, that's somewhat promising for his prospects moving forward. But, playing this situation week to week, we still don't really know. I mean, Bill Belichick could pull a fast one on us and run LeGarrette Blount 25 times this upcoming week. So, keep that in the back of your mind. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they like the way Lewis fits into their scheme. He can kind of, run up the middle and provide some of that pass catching ability that Shane Vereen gave them last year, and obviously he's not there this time around. So they like what Lewis has to offer here. He has a nice matchup against Jacksonville, ranked 27th in rush defense last season. New England's favored by 2 touchdowns, one of the higher scoring teams here. And that price on DraftKings is just $4,200. You can put them in your RB2 spot or flex spot and really feel pretty confident about building around that.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said with those fumbles, we've seen many, many times over the years with Bill Belichick. You see running backs like Shane Vereen fumble one time, not even come back in the game. And I mean, we've even seen guys be benched the following week with this. So definitely has a lot of faith in him to continue to give him those extra looks. Isaiah Crowell next for the Cleveland Browns. Like you mentioned, week 1, didn't really have much of a chance to get going. They ended up getting down quickly. Game was never really close against the Jets. But last week, we saw him get 15 carries for 72 and a touchdown. And also, like you mentioned here, he's got a lot of power. And he's the goal line back. And obviously he's facing an Oakland defense that has given up a ton of points, over 30 points each of the first 2 weeks. This is a defense that is what we thought it was, and it's pretty terrible.
Yeah, and you like that, as we said in the defensive podcast, we got Oakland coming back out east, traveling across the country, so it's very probable that they lay an egg on both sides of the ball, and I think Crowell would definitely be in line to do some damage if that's the case. Oakland was the worst defense against fantasy running backs last season. And yeah, Crowell really got it going. 15 carries, 72 yards, as you mentioned last week. And he, even though it's more of a committee still, and they hold firm by that in Cleveland, I mean, he looks like the best back, and he is going to get the goal line touches. So you can feel reasonably confident in him in this matchup just by game flow and, him seeing those goal line carries.
Yeah, and the Browns don't really have a go-to guy in the passing game either, so this is still a run-first offense, as we saw. I mean, yeah, Johnny Manziel only attempted 15 passes last week. So
their offensive line is pretty underrated, too. I mean, they were good last year, past 2 years as well. I mean, they really usually don't have a chance to showcase that because they usually fall behind. But, yeah, it's a very understated offensive line that Crowell's running behind.
Yeah, absolutely. GPP plays. We got indications earlier today. Bill O'Brien says he doesn't expect Arian Foster to play week 3, much to the chagrin of more so season-long players than DFS players. But that just opens the door for Chris Polk, who, I mean, is obviously proven to be a much more reliable, better back than Alfred Blue, because we've seen Alfred Blue before. The guy's simply nothing special. He's a strong back, and that's about it. So Chris Polk now, 5,300 on FanDuel, near minimum there, 3,400 near minimum on DraftKings as well. Going up against Tampa Bay defense that's just simply not very good, especially now that we see DeAndre Hopkins now has a concussion. Maybe he doesn't play. This is definitely going to be a run-first type of offense, especially if Hopkins sits. Yeah,
and Houston's favored by 6.5 here at home against Tampa Bay, whose defense really isn't anything special. And we said in the last podcast outlining defenses that, Houston Texans on defense line up pretty well. Maybe they can get a couple turnovers, leave the offense in some pretty good field position. That would line up well for Polk here. He had 16 touches last game compared to Alfred Blue just seeing 6. So, I mean, the scales are really tipping in his favor, and I think the coach likes what he brings to the table, likes his explosiveness. He can catch passes out of the backfield. I mean, he's more shifty, easily more shifty than Alfred Blue here, who's more of a plotter. And so 3,400 on DraftKings, I think he fits in there pretty well. And if he gets into the end zone, breaks one, which he could easily do, he's definitely going to pay off that price point and give you some cap space to go up to the other studs.
Certainly. And then another guy that can open up some cap space, especially on DraftKings, Frank Gore for the Colts. We've seen this offense, Andrew Luck in particular, look really bad in the first few weeks, but this is a Titans defense that was horrible against the run last year. They haven't been much better here. Frank Gore, if you look at the numbers, didn't have a great game, but as you mentioned here, did cause his own fumble without the help of anyone else as he's going into the end zone. So could be a much different story with Frank Gore if he ends up scoring that touchdown. Different story for the Colts and overall, really, because, ended up that game was would have been close had that not been for that fumble. So Frank Gore, a guy that, obviously they don't have anyone to replace him. It's not a scenario where, it's not a New England Patriots one where we're going to see him get benched for fumbling the ball, anything like that. He's still the guy there. That's the reason they brought him in. And you got to expect his ownership's going to be really, really low due to his lackluster performances the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, and the matchup sets up really good at Tennessee, who was 31st in run defense last season. Everything we've seen of them this season, they don't look a whole lot better. Obviously, that first game they got off to a huge lead, so Tampa didn't run the ball too much on them. But we saw Crowell, the guy we mentioned earlier, put up that nice stat line, very efficient stat line on them last week. So Indianapolis could kind of carry that over again. And I'm expecting Andrew Luck to be much better this time around, a little bit softer of an opponent. He could really get things going, moving the ball up and down the field, and leaving Frank Gore to finish off a couple drives. So I think he's a very solid mid-range pick, value play here. $7,000 on FanDuel might be a bit too pricey. Obviously, just GPP consideration. I think he can do better for cash games at that price level, but $4,500 on DraftKings is pretty tempting, and he could catch a couple passes out of the backfield too. We know Indianapolis likes to do that, so racking up those PPR stats is never a bad thing on DraftKings.
No, not at all. And another guy who's in a nice game flow, it's you see a guy who's named Johnson that plays for the Cardinals, and his name's not Chris Johnson, who was a popular play last week, but we all knew what Chris Johnson, not what he was, but what he's become, and that's just a guy that just doesn't have that second gear anymore. He's a guy that's not particularly elusive. We saw 20 carries for 72 yards, and we saw fantasy owners see Johnson scoring a touchdown, see that they're happy, but, it was David Johnson that was making plays, and Chris Johnson, you hear these rumors and these things, coach coming out saying that he's still going to be the workhorse and things like that, but, he's no longer an explosive player, but David Johnson did show that he was an explosive player last week, and this is San Francisco defense to give up 3 rushing touchdowns to D'Angelo Williams last week, and you got to imagine that David Johnson, maybe not that kind of success, because obviously 3 touchdowns is out of the realm of possibility for most people, but certainly at his low price and low ownership, there's still going to be plenty of people on Chris Johnson.
Yeah, because he is going to be the number 1 back, as you mentioned, but they also said that they want David Johnson involved a little more, so I don't know if he's going to eat too much into Chris Johnson's carries, or where that's going to be at, where they're going to split it 50-50 or anything like that, but it's pretty clear that David Johnson does have the explosive potential, the big play potential that Chris Johnson simply does not have anymore. So you could look at him to hit a home run or two. Most season-long guys are going to take a wait-and-see approach before inserting him into their lineups. That's probably the way to go in that realm. But in daily, if you're looking for a tournament guy with some explosive potential, who can give you 10+ fantasy points in 1 carry, he's the guy. And he's shown it over the past few games, and he should get. There should be a lot of carries to go around really in this game, because Arizona is a home favorite by 7 against San Francisco, who gave up 3 touchdowns to D'Angelo Williams last week. So, and you like the way Carson Palmer's moving the ball for that offense, so maybe he can get him in the red zone and get David Johnson the ball. Kind of like what happened towards the end of the game last week against the Bears. He took a 30-yarder to the house. So you're just hoping the game flow works out that way, and if it does, he'll get his carries and maybe he'll do something with it.
Yeah, and that's a great point about Palmer in the passing game, because they've been incredible in that passing game so far. So obviously going to be plenty of lanes to run, because opposing defenses aren't going to be keying on stopping the run with Arizona. They're going to be looking to stop the pass, and with that obviously comes a lot more holes, less guys in the box, and more running opportunities for these backs. So Last guy, going to step into the big role once again. He's had a chance before and has been disappointing at times, but we've seen some big upside. Devonta Freeman stepping back in as the feature back now that we see Tevin Coleman at least out for a few weeks with a broken rib. 6,500 on FanDuel, 46 on DraftKings against Dallas, and don't overreact to what you saw from DeMarco Murray and the Eagles and think that this is a very tough run defense. I mean, it's not a great defense. It's not a terrible defense, but certainly one that's beatable. And, I mean, that was more of a product of the Eagles just being absolutely terrible than it was the Cowboys' defense being very good. But Devonta Freeman's the guy that catches passes. He's explosive, and he should be heavily involved in this game here once again.
Yeah, he's a pure volume play for value here, especially on DraftKings. As you said, he should catch a couple swing passes, screen passes within the offense just to kind of keep the pace down so they don't have to throw to Julio Jones every single time. I mean, they have to give it to someone else, before Julio Jones' legs fall off. So Freeman is that guy. He's just going to see it, more carries than he probably should, given his talent level. But he'll be involved, and Atlanta actually checks in as a favorite in this game, given that Brandon Weeden will be the starting quarterback for the Cowboys. So if the game flow works out that way, maybe he'll get 15 to 20 carries, which only helps his fantasy potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to wrap things up for us here. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. We got lots of great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.